prison. And we can speak to Joanne, which isn't a real name, has been good enough to join us. Joanne, your parents spent time in prison when you were a child. How was that for you?
Well, to be honest, I was so young, I don't really remember. But the last memory of my dad is seeing him in a prison in room. My mum told me that the prison officers would sort of play with us, we'd run around. I don't really remember it, to be honest. But now I realise it with my own kids.
Okay, so from your mum, did you get any sense that it got any support, told how to explain it to their children, how to make sense of it?
No, there was nothing. There was no support at all. We were just left to it, yeah.
And do you know how unusual it would have been in your community at the time?
Sort of stigma attached to it, really, because like if your parent goes to prison, like that's not a good thing. Nobody really wants to know you or socialise, make friends with someone who's like involved with criminals.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, since then, I understand you've been in prison yourself. How did you have children at the time?
So I'd not long had a little baby girl. Unfortunately, she was taken into care. I spent some time in prison, and by the time I was released, they'd put her up for adoption, and she was adopted out of the family. And that was like 15 years ago.
So what is your understanding of the support, if any, available to the kids of mums and dads who go to prison? And the vast majority are dads, and as we just heard Sandra Kane say, it's an even greater calamity generally if the mother goes to prison. But is there anything in place? Are the school told? Or there
is now, told? But there wasn't before. So when the children that I have now, when their father went to prison, for 2 years we was unsupported and our life just spiraled downhill. And then I made the school aware, and they found this wonderful charity called Children Heard and Seen, who come into our lives and has like really, really helped us, given us support, made us know that, we're not the only ones out there that have a parent in prison.
And what did you learn about what to tell your own children about their father who's in prison?
Well, to be honest, for the first 2 years, I told them that he was working away, because I didn't want them to feel any of the stress and the strains of, oh, my daddy done a bad thing and now he's not here anymore. Because he was great with them before he left, and then obviously one day he was there and the next he wasn't, and it was quite confusing. It took us a long time to sit and explain to them like where he was, and they had a lot of questions, which this beautiful, amazing charity, Children Heard and Seen, helped us. Made a plan, and sort of we sat and told the children, and they answered their questions, and Okay. Without them, I don't think we would have been still stuck in that dark hole.
Okay, well, stay with us, Joanne, if you can, because we can talk to the founder of Children Heard and Seen, this charity which Joanne mentioned, who's Sarah Burrows. Sarah, firstly, it's worth pointing out there's a lot of this about, because when I first saw that book in the primary school, I thought, well, it must be a relatively rare thing. But there's some figures I got that this affects more children every year having a parent in prison than divorce and parents splitting up, which I thought can't be true. But as far as I can see, it is true. I mean, what kind of provision is there as it stands?
There's very little provision out there in terms of supporting children with a parent in prison. I mean, first of all, we don't know how many children there are. I mean, Crest estimates there's 312,000, and prior to that, Bernardo's estimated there were 200,000 a year. But we don't know. There's no mechanism to sort of identify children, let alone support them. We've had a number of children actually living on their own without an adult looking after them, pretending that their parent was at home going off to school every day. And in fact, there was no adult at home because, the children are slipping through the net. So we're not sure how big the problem is, but obviously there is the different figures of 312,000 or 200,000.
But how can there be no figures?
Lot of children.
I mean, because presumably you've got accurate figures for who's in prison. So
yes,
surely surely they must say, do they have any dependents?
They do, and if they don't declare that they do, then it's unknown. So there isn't a mechanism. Not the data teams and the communication teams people aren't talking to one another. So children are really slipping through the net. That surprises a lot of people. They would assume that we would know how many children that there are. But, I always say if I could tell you how many Labradors were registered last year, but I can't actually give you an accurate figure of how many children have a parent in prison. So, it is a sad state of affairs really in 2023.
But if they do know, so the prisoner in question has declared it, so to speak, then what does that trigger? Is there are social workers alerted, and most importantly, are the schools told?
No, social workers wouldn't be told unless the parent is in for maybe a sex offence, and then social care would go in but only to look in terms of the safeguarding concerns. Have those children been abused themselves? No, they haven't, and then leave. So it doesn't actually trigger a mechanism to support families at all. So no, children are not supported up and down the country when they have a parent in prison. I mean, a number of children are supported in terms of family visits. If they go on family visits, there's family services. But we work with about 365 children currently, and nearly 70% of them don't visit a prison. So they wouldn't be accessing any support and any support services because there's just nothing out there. So people are surprised, and schools don't know. I mean, they wouldn't know. So they might know if the family chooses. Like Joanna has said about that she chose to tell the school. But some schools don't know. They might read it in the paper and think, well, actually, I need to have the conversation and ask them. But they might not know that the parent isn't there. But also the child might not know themselves. They might say that, daddy's gone to work. They don't know. Or some children do know. We've had a number of children that have had to change their names because of the offending of the parent, and they've changed schools. And so they know where the parent is, but they've had to learn to live with it having to be a secret because families are judged in terms of what their parent did when actually it had nothing to do with them.
But the image I had in my mind when I saw that primary school, that book in the primary school library, was I just imagine some kid whose parent was in prison sort of shyly picking it up and looking at it, and then everyone looking at him. I couldn't quite sort of picture it.
No, and I think you're right in terms of that secrecy around. And I think the great thing about books like that, but there really aren't, there's very little out there. It is for children to see other children and realise that they're not the only ones. Because I think the parent in prison bit, you have the stigma, the shame and the isolation. And a lot of what our support is actually seeing that you're not responsible for your parents offending, but you see other children, you see that they're as normal as you. Because I think that whole secrecy bit, and as you say, like that book there in a library and picking it up, and children might not have disclosed to anybody, including obviously their friends at school or the teacher, that their parent is actually in prison.
When somebody goes to prison, are there any resources provided to prisoners? Like if you've got children, make sure their mother reads this leaflet or something. Is there anything like that?
I think probably from prison to prison, it varies from prison to prison in terms of what resources are out there. That they're obviously the family services in terms of with the MOJ and supporting around families visiting. But what services are there for them to get in touch? I mean, families report that when their child's father or mother has been sentenced, they assumed that someone was going to get in touch and tell them about support services. And then, all our referrals currently are from families referring themselves. And we cannot cope with the capacity of other agencies referring to us. And it is that families are Googling, trying to find support out there, because there is so little for families.
The Ministry of Justice has just told us that they're going with the figure of approximately 200,000 children being affected by a parent being in or going to prison over the course of a year. And they also say there's a prison strategies white paper which commits to improving data and with the aim of improving understanding of the number of children with parents in prison and how parental incarceration impacts children's outcomes, including education, employment and future offending. Well, I mean, I dare say you can help them with that. So what tends to be the impact of having a parent in prison?
I think it's very individual, and there is a small piece of research that looks at 65% of boys with a parent in prison go on to offend themselves, and that was the reason that the charity was set up, to break that intercycle, offending, but it's much more now about the stigma and shame. But definitely children in terms of school attendance can be, children are being bullied, don't want to go to school. We have had situations of children who have witnessed their mother being beaten up for their father's offences, then being beaten up at school and therefore not being able to go back, faeces coming through the letterbox, concrete blocks through the window. I mean, real sort of traumatic stuff that's not their fault in any way. And in terms of then their self-esteem, their belief in themselves it isn't surprising in terms of the school attendance being low for children.
Joanne, briefly, just one bit of advice you wish you could have given your younger self. I know you were very young, but what would it be?
Just to not blame myself for their crimes and know that it wasn't me that committed the offence, for my dad to go to prison, and just get support. There needs to be support. There must, knowing that you're not alone in the situation, and there are other children out there with parents in prison, and their children heard and seen, they've changed our life around.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. Joanne, thank you very much. Also to Sarah Burrows from the charity Children Heard and Seen. If you